This weekend, we are anticipating large-scale No Kings protest here in the city of Chicago and really throughout the state. And even today, as we began the day, we saw clashes between protesters and city and state law enforcement there in Broadview. We took you there just a short time ago where you could see things were fairly peaceful at the moment, but as troubling as some of the scenes that we have seen play out there have been, some fear not only about what we're seeing, but that it could be getting worse. And in fact, that maybe some of the worst chapters in our nation's history could be repeating themselves. University of Chicago professor James Martin Vaughn is with me now. Certainly appreciate your time on this Friday.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Look forward to this conversation. If we just take the Boston Massacre, for example, which is an event that many people believe sparked the American Revolution, protesters were shot by British troops. As someone who studies history, do you see it playing out again?
Well, I think that nothing exactly repeats itself, but certainly there are similarities. The Boston Massacre was caused by an unintentional, accidental shooting of British redcoats, British soldiers on basically protesters in Boston, and that triggered essentially a really further breakdown in relationships between the American colonists and British ministers and officials, leading to the American Revolution. So, yes, I think these kind of encounters between federal authorities and local protesters, if are ripe for unintentional, accidental, bad acts that can worsen political relations locally and nationally.
Yeah, it's a big part of what we've been seeing and speaking about here in Chicago and really all, several major cities, LA, Washington, D.C., of course. But then, you have this immigration fight going on. And on the other hand, there's the Supreme Court taking up the Civil Rights Act.
Yes. I would say the thing, of course, to keep in mind is that ultimately, what led from the massacre to the American Revolution, which was an increase of violence, is because ultimately the colonial American resistance movement, the colonial radicals, did not have any recourse other than to arms, because the British Empire was essentially shutting down paths of what might be called civil resistance, civil reform, civil change. And what's obviously still open to us is open to the American people, is whole series of other perfectly legal, judicial, legislative actions in response to what's going on.
Yeah, and we've definitely seen a slew of quick, fast, and in a hurry lawsuits that have been taking place, from everything from the tactics that federal agents have used to the need for body cameras, the fences, and so many other things. But when you talk about that resistance movement, just the other day we saw on the southeast side people coming out of their homes. They heard a sound of a clash, a collision between two vehicles, one of those being federal agents and the other, what they say were immigrants who were trying to get away from them. And they began to come out of their homes. So DHS says, well, they were throwing rocks at them. And then all of a sudden there was a plume of smoke over the whole area. So when you talk about that resistance movement, it does seem like people are standing up in many different ways.
Yes, that's right. And the point you bring up is an excellent one, because it was exactly in Boston in March of 1770, a confrontation between imperial authorities, British redcoat soldiers, and a kind of resistance movement organized in civil society, the Boston Sons of Liberty and others. And they were mixing, and this kind of situation is fraught with people miscommunicating, misreading one another. And it was precisely, redcoats believed they were having snowballs and rocks pelted at them, and one of them believed that they were under assault and fired, and as a result Other troops also thought that they were being given the order to fire, and they fired on the crowd, and several innocent people, protesters, died. And so, exactly, these situations are very fraught ones, and that's the problem. It's not, of course, the should be emphasized. The British Redcoats and the federal authorities are acting legitimately within the law. That is to say, the Redcoats did have the authority to do what they're doing, and the federal agents do have the authority to do what they're doing. But of course, these things are political decisions, whether or not you're going to employ redcoats amongst the civilian population in Boston in 1770, or federal authorities, federal, ICE agents and National Guard troops amongst a civilian population in Chicago in 2025. These are political decisions, and in making those decisions, one needs to be aware that precisely the kind of tensions, anxieties, conflicts that arise can lead to miscommunications, misunderstandings, where people are shot at, and violence breaks out. And it's precisely why, even though everyone can be acting legitimately, meaning people have a right to protest and dissent and to organize, to put pressure on elected officials to change the policies they're pursuing. Likewise, the federal government has the right to pursue enforcement of immigration law. And so two rights can often disastrously encounter one another and produce a violent situation that escalates.
Yeah, and there's a few different things that I think I want to break out from what you just said there. One, what we saw on the Southwest side just a few weekends ago when a woman was shot, and that created a clash there. Now, the DHS will say that the agents were actually being followed. And so there's some part that people have to take in. Well, what led up to that moment where someone was shot? But what took place after that? There were a string of press conferences, whether it was the Superintendent Snelling, who had a press conference to talk about, okay, well, their rules of engagement are very different from our rules of engagement. And for sure, the rules of engagement for local and state law enforcement have changed drastically to be a little bit more transparent and to de-escalate in recent years versus what we're seeing in some of these instances with federal authorities.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And obviously, and here is a historical parallel. In colonial North America, for decades, there were no soldiers in peacetime, meaning there were no standing armies of British soldiers, British redcoats. And British ministers and officials, much like the Trump administration in 1768, decided to deal with what they viewed as a lack of enforcement of their policies and growing lawlessness. They stationed these redcoats, these soldiers, very unusually in Boston, the heart of a bustling port city. And as such, basically, they created this situation where there were two forces confronting one another that really hadn't dealt with each other before. Mm-hmm. British civilians and protesters in Boston hadn't really been used to redcoat soldiers stationed amongst them. They didn't know they were often unfamiliar with the rules and codes and all of that. And likewise, the British regulars from the UK, from Great Britain, they didn't have any familiarity with the colonial populations, its customs, its habits, etc. So I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but these kinds of situations are extremely fraught. They can lead to confrontations, accidents happen, people mishear things. You can think there's a shot being, I've many times been walking on a city street in Chicago, and a car's backfired when it's starting up, and I thought it might be a gun. Yeah. You can just imagine what could happen in these kinds of situations when a federal agent mishears something or might think that there's a kind of shot being fired, and so on and so forth. The one thing I will say that might sound more hopeful is that the founders, that is the people who designed the federal republic which we live in, precisely didn't want single concentrated power. They wanted checks and balances and divided government. And they wanted states and localities to balance against the federal government, and the federal government to balance against states and localities. So the flip side of everything we're seeing, like the conflicts between the federal government, the DHS, let's say Donald Trump and Kristi Noem on one side, and on the other, our governor and our mayor, J.B. Pritzker and Brandon Johnson. These conflicts are both sides pursuing the legitimate authority and interests of the people they represent. Meaning Trump and Noem represent a certain national mandate won in the election in 2024, and Johnson and Pritzker represent a local and state mandate, respectively. And so this kind of divided government checks and balances, where the federal government is trying to pursue its immigration enforcement authority, and state and local governments are insisting on their ability to, have local police power and regulate local exchanges. This is, in one sense, the system working. This is kind of divided government and checks and balances playing out, and people taking the federal government to court, court cases hearing themselves out. It can look like a great deal of turbulence, but what's really important is this turbulence has been, for the most part, peaceful. It can kind of, seem extremely confrontational to us, the way that Pritzker and Trump are talking about one another, but this is actually how the system is designed to work. These kind of checks and balances and divided government, with the authorities of Chicago and Illinois using their legitimate powers and appealing to their publics, and the authorities of the federal government in Washington, D.C. using their legitimate powers and appealing to their publics, and things really ultimately being settled in the courts, not only the judicial courts, but also the courts of public opinion.
Yeah, and you mentioned the mandate. Of course, Donald Trump would say that he was given a mandate to reduce crime with the last election, and that's what he is seeking to do. Of course, I was just at the Dirksen Federal Courthouse, last Thursday, and a judge was saying, you may not see it the same way that I do, but this is my ruling, and it was against the federal government, and saying that, well, even if you don't think that I have the right to do this is checks and balances. So to your point there, that was the judge's point exactly. Let me ask you this. So if you think about the Boston Massacre and the propaganda aspect of that, we've seen a bit of that with what we've been seeing lately as well. Would you agree?
Yes, you mean the way that people are organizing in civil society, and kind of there is a very strong similarity in the sense that the Boston Sons of Liberty, they were very upset about the new imperial policies and the stationing of British troops in the city. And so they exactly passed around leaflets, pamphlets, magazines, newspapers. They put up posters and signs and coordinated a kind of civil resistance to what was going on with the British redcoats. I think it's kind of very similar to a lot of civil resistance being organized against ICE raids and other sorts of federal authorities.
Yeah, but of course now we have social media. Let's talk about that aspect of things, because it has totally changed the game. And we just had a conversation with a professor a few days ago, a congressman, just a few days ago about bot farms and this aspect of political violence that's coming from bots online.
Can I ask, because I'm not familiar with this, how are bots committing violence?
Inciting it.
Sorry.
Inciting
okay.
it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Inciting it. No, that's definitely a question. I mean, there's no question. If you were to look at the Boston Massacre, both sides, both the British imperial authorities and the colonial American resistance movement, their propaganda is extremely aggressive, extremely, in rhetoric, violent. The other side is seeking to destroy liberty. And the other side, the British authorities say that the colonial American resistance movement are rebels and they're going to lead to anarchy. I mean, it sounds a great deal like the Trump administration. Likewise, the colonial American resistance movement says that the other side is basically plotting to enslave the colonists, to create a kind of autocracy in the colonists and destroy all their freedoms, not unlike the rhetoric of anti-Trump forces about there being a kind of attempt to subvert constitutional democracy. Yeah. So it's absolutely the case that the kind of rhetoric we saw around the Boston Massacre is being generated now.
And of course, the rhetoric that we've seen in recent years, we could list off the incidents of political violence that's come from that, that's gotten to we were just talking about a tipping point for environmental things, but a tipping point too for political rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that social media is leading to more exaggerated political rhetoric. The one thing, though, worth keeping in mind is American history has been punctuated by these kinds of conflicts between federal and state and local authorities, accompanied by extremely aggressive political rhetoric, even more than now. But ultimately, only on one occasion, and that was the refusal of certain states to accept the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, was there ever any departure from our normal constitutional system into something like full-scale violence, i.e. the Civil War.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are your students asking about? Seeing what's going on, especially students here in Chicago that are coming into your classroom. They're looking and listening to your conversations, your lessons about history. What are they asking about in terms of what they're seeing play out in real time?
I mean, one thing that students bring up a lot now, particularly I teach a class on the spring of the American founding, is what about this rhetoric about Civil War, right? They feel that a lot of the media, social media, traditional media is talking about kind of polarization getting so out of hand. Could there be a Civil War? And you see this discussed on left and right. And I think a lot of students find this extremely puzzling. And so that's an issue they often want to talk about, is there a potential go to civil war? And what is especially, one of the reasons why this comes up is the more they study history, the more they see how much our past is riddled with extreme conflict, right? Constitutional democracy is not the end of conflict. Constitutional democracy is actually basically, if I can put it this way, meant to be peaceful civil war, right? We have disagreements. We fundamentally disagree on how we should live together and how the country should be governed and organized. And constitutional democracy is the peaceful battle to try and win out one another. And it can get very heated and aggressive in rhetoric and polarization, but provided it doesn't spill out into full-scale violence, such as only happened once really in the Civil War, it remains. It remains in place. So something always, I think, worth keeping in mind about this question about Civil War is of course, one needs prudence. That is, one shouldn't just create situations where violence could potentially escalate, like we're seeing these fraught situations, such as when ICE officers launched tear gas that I believe not only affected protesters, but Chicago CPD.
Correct.
These kinds of situations are, of course, extremely imprudent and bad. On the other hand, I might be too optimistic about this, but on the other hand, I see enough of our divided government and checks and balances working, and it's good to express differences and conflict. That can actually be a system working through its problems. It can seem to a lot of people, I often get this because I have a number of international students from China, and can seem to people like China is a much calmer political system under Xi Jinping. But it's precisely that people can't express themselves and can't protest, and there isn't conflict between divided government. It's a single party unitary state. So all the discontents in society, all the problems people have with authorities and with one another, never get expressed. And so when that country reaches a tipping point, it will likely be a violent one. Whereas in the US, actually, this kind of expression of conflict and protest and this open, rhetorical warfare between Trump and Pritzker and Johnson and the No Kings movement and people on Fox News, all of this kind of stuff. This kind of stuff can actually, in one way, be the system working, expressing our discontents, having our conflicts, fighting it out. Polarization is not such a bad thing. it can actually be the renewal of the strength of a society.
Well, I like to leave things on a glass half full outlook, so we'll end the conversation there. Thank you so much for joining me today. Again, it is going to be a big weekend. We're watching for several protests that will take place, so hopefully people that were listening to this conversation right now approach it with a little bit more context.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your time.